We are recording this podcast on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We wish to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening. Hello and welcome to Novel Feelings, where two psychologists take a deep dive into your favourite books. I'm Elise, just doing a quick solo intro for today. Today we are very excited to have an interview with Robyn Dennison coming up, author of the newly released Blind Spot. About Robyn, so Robyn Dennison's fiction has appeared in Australian literary journals, including as a runner-up for the Overland VU Short Story Prize. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, where she teaches creative writing. Blind Spot, her first novel, was shortlisted for the Text Prize. A little bit about the book. So, when Dale stumbles into a bedroom at a party and sees a drunk girl being undressed by a group of guys, he backs away and runs. He's pretty drunk himself, but he knows what he saw. Why didn't he stop them? Why did he run? These questions haunt him. He wants to make things right, but he doesn't know how. There's no way he can talk to his dad. His mum walked out months ago, and his best friend Kieran wouldn't understand. Then Max arrives, Dale's cousin. She's older, smart, cool, with her own perspective on Dale's problem and her own problems too. Thank you so much to Text Publishing for linking us together for this interview. Just a quick couple of notes before we get started. So first of all, we recorded this one in person in a recording studio, which is very exciting for us, but unfortunately we did have some tech issues and the audio quality is a little bit different to normal. I've done my best, of course, to work around this with editing, but we might sound a little different, so apologies for that. And then our usual disclaimers. So first of all, we're trained psychologists, but this podcast should never be taken as direct therapeutic advice. The first half of this interview is spoiler-free, but the second half does contain some spoilers. And a couple of content notes for today. So some of the topics that come up in this interview include sexual assault and trauma, alcohol and cannabis use, depression, eating disorders, including broad discussions of food restriction and other disordered eating behaviours, as well as treatment, and family separation. All right, so now over to our interview with Robyn.
All right, so Robyn, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you going?
I'm good, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. We are actually recording today in person, which is extremely rare for us. So thank you so much, Robyn, for making your way here. I am looking forward to this interview and to learning a little bit more about Blind Spot.
I'm looking forward to it too. Blind Spot deals with some very important topics, but the main one is that it's about people who witness or otherwise know about sexual assault but do nothing about it. Why did you decide to write a book about this topic?
I don't know that I ever did per se consciously decide to write a novel about that, although it did start with this image or idea of someone kind of stumbling into witnessing something and then having the immediate gut reaction of just backing away and not doing anything.
Which is quite a powerful scene, I will say, like a powerful image as well, and I can see why that might prompt so much story to come out of it.
Yeah, it was also quite a while ago now. I did start the novel in like 2013, I think.
Oh, wow.
So, and at the time I had already had the idea, but then I started working on a minor thesis here at Melbourne Uni that was about the representation of sexual violence in young adult fiction. And so even while I'd already kind of had the idea and maybe I'd started working on it, I don't think I would have seen it through to fruition without that thesis and without doing that research.
That sounds like really interesting research. Yeah, what was that like?
Yeah, it was great. I analysed Kirsty Egar's 2009 novel, Raw Blue. I don't know if either of you have read it. It's a great Australian YA novel. Yeah, my thesis was actually about narrative tense, like present tense and first-person narration.
Oh, interesting.
And the idea of like victim narratives versus survivor narratives. And yes, an excerpt from an early draft of what would become Blind Spot was the creative component of that thesis. On that topic about choosing to write about a bystander rather than about a victim or survivor themselves, like I said, I don't think it was conscious, but I don't know, I'm aware that it's like a delicate terrain.
Yeah. It's a perspective that I don't think I've really read from before, which was interesting because I've definitely read quite a bit of survivor literature and I've even read perpetrator perspectives as well. Not that the novels I've read have been condoning that, but from that perspective. But I don't think I've ever read a witness's perspective.
Yeah, I think, and maybe this was more true at the time that I started the novel, but the social discourses, I feel like it's maybe more acceptable now to have written it than it was at the time that I started it, where we really were having more conversations about people being able to tell their own stories. And so I was acutely aware of the risks of kind of it being interpreted or coming across as kind of like Boyd becomes self-actualized by violence done to a woman.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it comes across like that at all. I suppose I also wonder if we're now at a time where we can accept that moral complexity, I suppose, that Dale's not immediately labeled a villain. Like he's obviously done the wrong thing, and we all have that gut feeling of like, well, of course I would have said something in that moment, but maybe we're now ready for this narrative where, well, what if he wouldn't actually do that in the moment? Does that make you a horrible person?
Yeah. And I mean, I don't mean yes, it makes you a horrible person. Yes, I think we are more, maybe because there have been so many stories from like victims and survivors' perspectives that it's more acceptable now to kind of broaden that lens. And it definitely partly came from being interested in shared responsibility and ideas about like passivity and inaction and then also like shame and atonement, if that's possible.
And those are definitely all topics that we're going to be covering through the interview. We started to touch on this, but considering Dale's moral transgression before the start of the novel, it would have been pretty easy for him to be written as an unlikable character. But I know as a reader myself, I was able to feel sympathy for him without condoning his actions. How did you approach writing him with this kind of complexity?
That was definitely the trickiest part of writing the novel, and I think is the main reason why it took so long to write and went through so many different drafts, because it's not meant to be ambiguous whether he did the wrong thing or not. Like, as you've already said, it's clear that he should have done something. And so then trying to balance that with, just because you've done something wrong or you failed to do something when you should have done something, does that make you completely irredeemable? And I think a lot of it came down to trying to characterize Dale with complexity in the sense of him being quite a passive person and a person who feels like they don't have control over the situations they find themselves in. And having that recur throughout the narrative, I think, hopefully gives a sense of a little bit of insight into where this behaviour all kind of came from, Dale's
dealing with a lot of guilt and shame as a result of his inaction after witnessing the sexual assault, which then grow into self-loathing as the novel progresses. How would you describe his mental health throughout the novel?
Quite poor, if that's not overly simplifying or a bit bad to say. But as I already said, he struggles with feeling out of control, and I think he struggles to see himself as someone who can change anything. And he struggles to see himself as like an agent rather than, I think he even comes close to saying this at one point, like as someone who things happen to.
Powerlessness?
Yeah. And I think part of that is because of what's happened earlier this year where his parents have split up unexpectedly with his mother leaving. But yes, in terms of his mental health, he's definitely a very, very anxious, quite depressive person prone to shame And I think his main way of seeing himself as compared to others is through like feeling like he's not good enough. And like a lot of that is drawn from my own experiences with anxiety and depression. And I think there's like one part of the novel, which is probably the only part that I could say is like directly lifted from like how I feel about myself or words that I would use to characterize myself, where he's thinking about how other people see him. He phrases it around imagining that everyone is always watching him and judging him and finding him lacking. And that is pretty much like something I think I once said to my therapist. So yes, definitely some mental health struggles for Dale. And thankfully for me, a lot of that stuff is from past experiences and not current. Like I said, it took a long time to write the novel, but
I suppose I was interested in him self-medicating in a way. You wouldn't put it that way, but the drinking was quite obvious as well. It probably also stood out because of his age to me, and just me thinking, why is his dad letting him do this?
As we were talking about this afterwards, of as people who grew up with strict parents, how and I see this all the time in TV shows where, you know, the kids and teenagers are just like out partying, just like, oh yeah, I'll be back at some point, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, logistically, I could have never done that as a teenager. Not only were my parents had never let me, but just like logistics of getting to and from all these places. Someone who grew up in the country where everyone was very spread out, and like there was no opportunities for partying, not really. So it's very different reading about a community like Dale's and his relationship with drugs and alcohol as someone that was pretty sheltered from that.
Yeah, and I suppose I should add, you know, I didn't grow up in Australia, so that drinking culture is very different from what I experienced growing up. And I actually was very interested in Dale's parents as characters as well, because you can see their actions are driven by their own struggles, I suppose. But again, I will stop saying anything spoilery.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about the way that his dad lets him drink, because his dad lets him drink kind of only in moderation. I guess I would just come back to like Dale is 17. He's in his second to last year of high school. I mean, Dale doesn't have a healthy relationship with alcohol, but it probably does reflect my own perspective on how maybe parents can try to start teenagers off on a healthier relationship with alcohol, in that it's like it's not, if you make something forbidden, that you're more likely to go and do it. And it's like, I'd prefer you to do it in my house where I can see you, where you're not going to be driving.
Oh, yeah. I agree with that 100%.
In terms, just in terms of talking about his dad's approach. But his dad is also a fairly hands-off parent, which, you know, is...
Yeah, and I suppose we're catching him at a period where he's probably going through things that we're not seeing because we're following Dale's perspective. So he's coping with this separation himself, potentially, or this life transition from one stage to another. And maybe, he's just struggling to, like, what spoilery to say or not. I'm not at all implying that he's a bad dad, I suppose. No, it's just like, we're in Dale's perspective and, seeing him, like, sneak whiskey and, things that his dad probably would say no to, that I'm like, I think it's just that reaction that came out for me, which is not a judgment necessarily on his choices in terms of parenting and things like that.
But it is true, I think, that he's not a perfect dad. And I think that's fine. Sometimes in YA, not always, but sometimes I do kind of find that the parents are either like really, really terrible and really neglectful or abusive, or they're like basically perfect. And I think it was important to me to kind of have someone who's fundamentally, I think, a good parent and doing their best, but they're far from, like, they're not going to win any parenting awards that don't exist.
And speaking of Dale and his father, throughout the novel, they're supporting cousin Max through her recovery from an eating disorder. We meet Max at the start of the novel as she moves in, and we gradually get more of her story as we go along. I do want to ask a little bit more about her in the spoiler section, but just off the top of our heads, there were a few specific things that came up, a few specific family techniques that we identified when it comes to families supporting someone with an eating disorder, like having a meal plan and supporting them with a meal plan, trying not to comment on weight or appearances and so on. I'm just wondering if you were drawing from any particular treatment approaches or family approaches in this instance.
Not really beyond what I understand to be the fairly dominant way that these kinds of eating disorders are dealt with in this kind of treatment, where, yes, like, don't talk about how they look, and it is kind of seen as like a family, a shared kind of responsibility of like, we're all going to sit down and have a meal. I mean, I did a lot of research for the eating disorder component of the novel, but then I think some of it also is just a nice way to have those characters all interact, like having a family. I didn't grow up in a house where we had family meals very often, mostly because my sister and I did so much ballet that we didn't get home until like 8:30 at night.
That would make it hard. I was asking because what you included in the novel was very much making me think of family-based treatment, which is like the dominant approach for adolescents who are experiencing anorexia or I think sometimes bulimia, directly too. So a lot of it was like very closely aligned with my understanding of that. I've never delivered that or supported a family through it, so I don't have that kind of first-hand treatment experience, nor do I have like lived experience or caring experience. But I was curious, as like Max is sort of on the older end of that, and I've known some clients who have stopped FBT as soon as they turn 18 because they hate it so much and they refuse to participate anymore. So I was curious about Max's experience of Dale and his father supporting her in that way. Without going into spoilers, how would you say that impacted on Max, having that kind of family-based support at home?
I don't think it's something that's new to her, but of course Dale and his father, they're new to her. But I'm aware that Max's narrative, and maybe this is not answering the question, but I'm aware that Max's narrative resembles like the dominant narrative that we've been exposed to about eating disorders in women in adolescence in like Western culture, in that she's underweight and she's malnourished to the point where she needs medical intervention and her like recovery is medicalized. It was important to me that she not be that classic kind of anorexic figure of the perfectionist or like the high achieving student or like the type A kind of person. She is kind of messy and kind of drifting. She's actually an adult, so she doesn't really need, she's not like, she could refuse this treatment. Yeah. And without getting spoilery, it's unclear to what extent she's fully on board with the process and to what extent she's going through the motions.
I imagine it would have been, regardless of how dedicated or how committed she was to her recovery at the start, I imagine, we see it being hard on her, right? Like we see her struggling to get through meals. We see her, disconnected from others, and her mental health isn't great at the start of the novel either. But we know that quite explicitly in the narrative. But that kind of family-based support is really difficult, especially when people are supervising you or having some sort of control over your meals. It can be very difficult to go along with that when your instinct is telling you to not do that. Yeah, and I think that Dale and his dad are also kind of not sure what they're doing. Yeah. It doesn't sound like, I'm speaking as if I wasn't the person who wrote the novel. It doesn't sound like they ever had like a medical handover with any, or even a handover, quote unquote, with her mum.
She was just like, she needs a break. Here you go. Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of more like, this has been the norm in our house for so long because Max has been on this kind of hamster wheel of escalating recovery attempts, deterioration, escalating recovery attempts, deterioration for so long that this is just the way we do things. She has a meal plan. We try to get her to stick to it. Like, there is that kind of infantilizing, almost kind of conflict heavy, and again, kind of stereotypical vibe of like she's not always cooperative, which I don't think is the best way to talk about these things or think about these things. But I think it is something that happens, or certainly was like a big part of the conversations when I was growing up. And so I guess when she comes, it is kind of like, at one point I think she says, you know, everyone just needed a break, like we just needed a new context. But the pattern, I think, is just there of like, we have to have family meals and this is what Max is allowed to do and this is what she's not allowed to do, I guess just came with the territory. I think one of the motivations to have Max's narrative be what it is that I am quite interested in disordered eating, and I don't tend to find that many representations of it in fiction. It's interesting because I think, unfortunately, disordered eating is so prevalent and is an issue that so many people struggle with, but it's kind of curious that it doesn't pop up a little bit more in fiction.
I think eating disorder, or any mental health disorder really, you can't package easily into a neat narrative.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a lot more representation of anorexia than other eating disorders too. A little bit more happening in bulimia and binge eating disorder these days, but yeah, not as much.
Yeah, and that's what I am kind of referring to when I say, like, I'm aware that that this is kind of a normative narrative. It's like already the dominant narrative, and so in a way you're kind of reinforcing that by because I do think in terms of how prevalent these things are in the real world, anorexia is probably overrepresented in fiction and even memoir, whereas something like bulimia, binge eating disorder, or like, you know, do they still say eating disorder not otherwise specified, or have they replaced
it's like
that term?
OSFED now, other specified feeding and eating disorder, which is a ridiculous name, and like
OSFED.
Ed, I think most people still say EDNOS.
Yeah. That's by far like the most common, and like now, like what you might call orthorexia, or do they still call that something, or did they rename that too? I'm showing my age.
No, orthorexia is not technically a diagnosis, but like, it's a real thing. It's just not in the diagnostic manual. So, yeah, I think orthorexia is way more common than the diagnosable eating disorders, because I guess it's technically subclinical, but it can be just as damaging as other eating disorders. So, yeah, shocking.
Yeah, I definitely feel like most of the people I know, including myself, who have struggled with disordered eating in their lives, it's not necessarily been through something that would be diagnosable as anything other than EDNOS or OSFED. But yeah, it doesn't pop up that often as a character trait, like as a kind of like something that a character is struggling with, or something that they are. Something that their dilemmas are explored through the motif of in fiction, whereas other mental health issues or substance abuse issues, I feel like pop up a bit more often. But maybe that's my own bias, where I want to see more complex, fictionalized explorations of those kinds of issues. And so I'm like noticing that it's not there and seeking it out.
Yeah. So we're probably getting to the point where we can't really say much more about Blind Spot without going into spoilers, but we do have a couple of wrap-up questions before we head into spoiler territory, or full-on spoiler territory anyway.
Yeah, so not necessarily related to Blind Spot, but can you tell us a bit about your PhD? What are you researching?
My PhD research is about queer girls as main characters in Australian realist YA. So that can be any form of queerness, however subtle, and I'm only looking at realist text, so not genre, like, you know, just for scope, like it wasn't feasible to include everything. So the novels that fit that scope are, I think there's about 37, maybe 38 of them published between 1987 and 2022, and
That feels like both a lot and not enough.
It's a lot to talk about in a thesis, but it doesn't seem like that many in the grand scheme of how many books have been published in that time.
Exactly, yeah. And it is a lot of books to talk about, and I do kind of only talk about a few as primary texts that I analyse in detail. But the thesis draft as it is, we'll see what my review panel says in a few weeks' time at my 3.5-year review. But the draft at the moment does have one very long chapter that is kind of like an overview of the entire corpus and does like a plot summary of every single novel, charting kind of the ideologies about identity, like sexual identity that are being engaged with by the novels. Something that I think is interesting is that I think there's this dominant narrative about queer YA that early novels were kind of all very tragic, all about suffering, all about death and bigotry. And that's just not really true in this corpus of texts, partly because I think a lot of those narratives actually come from the US, where there was a longer history of earlier novels in the 60s and 70s, whereas you don't really see, like, my corpus only starts in 1987, partly because, I'm not talking about male characters, I'm only talking about female characters. But I feel like a result of that narrative has been a rise in like optimism and wholesomeness that I'm not necessarily how to say this, a rise in optimism or wholesomeness that I think is interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I see literary criticism going both ways. I think we need more positive, optimistic stories. But then people saying, like, but that's not the reality for so many people, so there is still a place for tragic or sad or nuanced stories too.
Yeah.
Perhaps this does lead into our final non-spoiler question, which is something we ask everybody we interview, but do you have any authors or books that you'd like to recommend to our listeners? Sounds like you've been doing a lot of reading, of course, but regardless of whether or not they are relating to a PhD.
I mean, from the PhD corpus, the author that I'm most preoccupied with, that I want to feverishly press in books into other people's hands, is Joanne Horniman, who I don't know if either of you are already familiar.
No.
Wrote a number of books in the 90s and the noughts, and then kind of last published a book in 2010, all of which are just gorgeously written, very, very nuanced depictions of mostly girls and women's experiences. Another writer who I'm obsessed with, whose work I love, but who I don't kind of understand why they're categorised as YA, is Margot Lanigan.
I think I've read something about her.
Is it Tender Morsels?
No,
Is that the one, there was a book about mermaids?
Sea Hearts?
Yes, I started reading that, and I was thinking the same thing. I'm not sure this is YA.
And Sea Hearts, I think, resembles YA than Tender Morsels. Her other novel, well, she did publish 2 realist YA novels in the 90s, but they're very hard to find now. And they're quite different to her later 2 novels. She's most famous for her short story collections. But I think it's really interesting. She's an amazing writer, and I love her books, but she's also an interesting figure to ponder the question of what YA is and what we mean by it. And if you publish something as YA, does that then mean that whatever you write next is going to be shoehorned into YA, however mysteriously it fits? Yes, my YA reading I mostly read Australian YA, and some of my favourites are Vicky Wakefield and Leanne Hall and Claire Zorn. Yeah, I don't know. Do I just list novels I love?
we can end it there and put some
Thank you.
Okay.
put some links in the show notes. Yeah, of course.
Absolutely. All right, let's dive into the spoiler questions. This would be fun.
Yeah, we've been skirting around them for long enough, so probably time for us to get into the juicy stuff.
The main topic that we touched on earlier is Dale's passivity, and this is something he struggles with throughout the novel in terms of knowing when to intervene, what to do, and ultimately how to make amends. This is the case for witnessing Chloe's assault, but also with failing to recognize Max's decline. Can you comment on these parallels?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely intentional. I think on a practical level, I knew that the novel needed a subplot, and I mean, it probably didn't need, but I wanted it to have like a prominent, complex female character, because I knew early on that Chloe wasn't going to be a main character. I think one thing that I wanted to explore through that parallel was that Dale really is kind of befuddled and finds Max's illness so alienating. And to me, that was a way of engaging with what I see as being quite like gendered discourses around eating issues and body image and like diet culture. I remember when I was young, being struck, and hopefully this has changed, maybe it's changed, but being struck by how much, no matter how many red flags there were, often young men would be completely oblivious to women's and girls' struggles with eating disorders or body image. As much as Dale knows there's something to be concerned about, it's never really occurred to him before that this can be a problem for people, and he's not really sure what to do, which I think is part of what we see him struggle with in terms of when is the right time to intervene. Here I am again.
Yeah. And as you flagged before, we don't get any sort of handover as well. There's no education that they receive for when to, like, what are the red flags and when do you need to act on them. They're just are kind of left to their own devices about what to do. So, and that's
not, yeah, I guess at that family level, it's not Dale's fault for not knowing, but yeah, there's definitely that as well, that men are just not educated or, eating issues and body image issues are not discussed with them.
Or if they are, they're discussed in a different way.
Yeah.
And also, like, I don't want to blame Dale. Dale's 17. He's not the adult responsible for Max's well-being. But we do see his feelings of more intense, or continuing to build on the guilt and the shame that he's really struggling with throughout the novel.
Yeah, and I suppose for me, that the parallels make me think about how, again, that he's not this horrible person that would just walk away from an awful thing that he's witnessing. It's just that, in Chloe's case, it was that flight response, and then he could not work out what to do about that guilt and that shame. And in Max's response, it's almost, he can see all the signs, but not putting them together.
And neither does his dad either.
Yeah,
so,
there's no maliciousness in either of those incidents. But, he could have been more assertive, and which is just as a character flaw. It's not a moral failing, I suppose, to that sense.
And Max doesn't make it easy for him. The times that he does kind of say, okay, well, we really need to tell someone about this, like you just passed out or whatever, she's quite aggressive with him and like weaponizes the thing with Chloe, which, so I guess it is a dilemma, and his loyalties, and I think this partly reflects his age, like he is 17. His loyalty is to Max, and I think he thinks he's doing the right thing by doing what she wants him to do, even though the right thing to do would probably be to like call her doctor or at least her mum or at least tell his dad. I'm not actually sure what the right thing to do is, because, Max is an adult, and I think sometimes, like with a lot of mental health issues or substance use issues, Max is someone who needs to be like ready to try to recover and who needs to be wanting that. Otherwise, and she's just not there. So then I'm not sure if Dale had done something, would it have changed anything?
Maybe not. Speaking of Max, we don't really get a clear sense in the novel around the early development of her eating disorder. But of course, we do see its impact and the early stages of her recovery process. I'm wondering, in your minds, how did her eating disorder develop over time? Was there a clear trigger?
There definitely wasn't a clear trigger. Like I already said, I really didn't want Max to be the kind of classic narrative of the perfectionist who, in striving for perfection, kind of develops anorexia. And I also didn't want her to be someone who, like, when confronted with puberty was like, I can't, which is another kind of narrative. I think she tells Dale about a physical sickness that she had that was a bit mysterious in origin, that involved being quite sick and losing quite a lot of weight. And I think it is open to the reader to fill in the blanks of what the in-between years have looked like. I guess I'm drawn to not giving a clear narrative.
And that's okay.
Because I think that's how those things there's never just one answer to explain where things that we struggle with have come from. And
and I think that's what I like. One of the things that I like the most about the novel is that this hint to like the bigger picture. Like, we get a glimpse of Max's mum, and I think there was a line about how Max's mum and Dale's dad haven't spoken before this, and there was some sort of fallout. And I like that. Oh, I want to know more about that, but I like it being just sort of there as context clues in a way. And I also like Dale's parents' divorce, for example. We get glimpses of what they both went through in that marriage and separation. But again, this being Dale's story, we don't see the whole picture of what happened. But I like that this idea that, these side characters have their own full lives apart from what Dale can see. He doesn't always get the whole of it, but we as the reader can grasp, his mom's not terrible. She's just trying to make choices for herself, for example.
Not that Dale feels that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think not having a clear narrative with Max's story as well works really well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, that's true in life, isn't it? Like, everyone has entire complex full lives and pasts and that we can't see, and I think that fiction feels most satisfying when you get that sense as well, so thank you.
Nice. We found the relationship between Dale and Max quite touching as well. How would you describe the progression of their relationship throughout the book, including towards the end while Max is in hospital?
I think that early on, Dale is really quite intimidated by her, and he also looks up to her quite a lot, maybe inexplicably, maybe not. I'm very fond of her as a character, so, although I'm not sure she's... they're quite oppositional in their personalities. He's very passive, he's very shy, and she's outgoing and seems, at least on the outside, as self-assured, and she kind of says things that other people wouldn't necessarily say, and she just kind of at least gives the impression of being like unapologetically herself, and I think he really admires that, but he's also intimidated by it, and he wants her to like him. But then I think over the course of the novel he does start to realise that, Max needs him as much as he kind of needs her, or is leaning on him or wanting to lean on him. And I think they do end up in a more honest place, and their relationship kind of equalises out a little bit.
Yeah, I do like that moment towards the end where he visits her in the hospital, and she wants, was it drugs from him?
Yeah, I think she asks for weed. Is it weed? Yeah,
I think
but what she gets is actually alcohol. Yeah, I always get confused,
Yeah, but then he was trying to do the right thing by saying no to her, and then she turned quite cool towards him in that moment.
Lashes out.
Yeah, so I thought it's a nice contrast with earlier where Dale will, like, what you spoke about before, he thought the right thing was to go along with whatever she wanted. And because he cares about her like that, he also doesn't want to hurt her in that sense. But by that stage, he understands that doing the right thing is sometimes denying her what she wants. And even though she lashes out in that way, he still stands by that, which I think is quite a nice relationship and character progression.
Yeah, she's definitely flawed, as all of us are, and she does manipulate him or try to. And I think, you know, obviously she's in a really difficult situation and she's obviously struggling with things and she's trying to make the situation she's in tolerable.
We've spoken a little bit about Dale's passivity and how that's such a driving force for passivity being a driving force. Sounds weird, doesn't it? How it's such an integral character trait for him and the events of the novel. And I guess that's a bit of a sign of him taking some more agency, learning to say no and doing the right thing, even though it might be uncomfortable in that moment. And there is that parallel with the Chloe storyline, of course, too, where he is trying to make amends for what happened. I can't remember the line, but there was a line somewhere at some point. It was like, you can't change what happened, but you can do what you can to make it right. And I thought that was really, you know, it illustrates a nice character progression for Dale too, as the novel goes on.
Yeah, hopefully it's not too like, you know, please notice that this character has changed. They're being asked to do something and this time they're going to say no. But, I mean, we do all change and grow and we do learn, hopefully, learn from mistakes that we make, or we respond to a situation in one way and it goes badly, or we realise that that's not how we want to respond and we actually change the behaviour. They're quite small moments, but yes.
Well, those small moments are powerful. So how would you describe our main character's headspaces by the end of the novel?
That's such a difficult question. I don't really know. I am not a fan of happy or neatly resolved endings, and I think it's clear that he has come to some kind of acceptance, although there is the unresolved, like we don't actually follow to a resolution, the Chloe situation. It's
we get a hint that something might happen, but we don't know as readers, right?
Yes, so we're not entirely sure what Chloe means when she says that she might pass his number on, and we're not sure if she's going to actually do it. I know what I think, but, you know, it's open to interpretation. But beyond that being unresolved, I do feel like we leave him in a fairly calm place where he is kind of accepting what's happened and looking forward, looking to the future with maybe something a bit more optimistic than what he than the Dale of the beginning of the novel might have. But you know, people have commented that the ending is quite melancholic or unresolved. So I'm interested in, you know, like I wrote it, I can't get out from inside it, and so it's always interesting to
Unresolved is probably not the word that I would use. It feels like he's grown up, but it's not one of those books where something like sexual assault is dramatic in that narrative sense, but his growth is quiet, I would say. Like, it's a lot of it is quite internalized, like we are in his head a lot of the time. So I can feel that he has grown up because of these small moments that happen where he makes slightly different choices. So there was that thing about how, you know, don't expect Chloe to forgive you because this is not about you, it's about her. So, you know, it feels almost like he's a side character in Chloe's story, but we're following him for now, sort of thing. So,
or even a side character in Max's story.
Yeah.
He has this kind of important side character energy. And that's what makes it interesting.
Passive side character energy. Yeah, I like that. I actually really like that way of thinking about him.
And I don't mean that in a mean way by any means. I just think it's really, it's a good perspective that we don't get all the time.
It's reflective. Reflective is the word I was looking for. I mean, that's the tone of the novel for me. So when we get to the end, yes, there's no happy ending because there can't really be a happy ending to all the plots that are happening. You know, it will go on, and he is still growing up as well. So I feel like it feels like a glimpse of this section of his life, and we don't necessarily, you know, need to keep going because this is the part of his growth that the story was telling.
And I feel like, you know, we see him move from a point where he's, you know, at the start of the novel, his reflex in a challenging moment and witnessing something traumatic is to run away, not to do something. And again, it's not a choice, it's just what happened. I feel like the Dale at the end of the novel might not make the same, you know, have the same reflex in the moment. We don't know that, and the reality is most of us don't know what we would do if we were in that situation. We all want to say that we would do something, but we don't actually know if that's the case. So, yeah, I feel like he's in a better place.
Yeah, I think he's in a better place. I think my instinct is always to make, this is terrible, but always to make characters miserable.
Yeah.
And, you know, my instinct is to leave it even less resolved than it is. But I think, you know, it felt right to give that little bit of that hopefulness or that sense of he has changed and maybe he would make a different choice now. And also, you know, like, he's going to have to live with this for the rest of his life. Like, he's not going to forget about it. And we don't know what's going to happen to Max. Although in an earlier draft it was much more, not much more, but I would say noticeably more kind of implied that her struggles were going to continue.
And I guess, you know, of course, we don't get resolution around Chloe as well, but yeah, again, just keeping in mind that Dale's mental health is not Chloe's responsibility. So it's not up to Chloe. You know, her decision is her decision, and Dale is not, you know, not the most integral part of whatever she decides to do.
I guess the sense that they've all grown in some way, which I think is a nice way to finish the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, we're all always growing, hopefully, aren't we?
Hopefully.
Yeah.
I do think that one of the more obvious examples of Dale having changed or grown in terms of how he confronts difficult situations is when Brent breaks up with him. It's, you know, he handles it quite well. Like, good for him. Especially at 17. I did not have that emotional maturity when dealing with heartache when I was that age.
Yeah, we never actually discussed that, but I really like that doesn't have that happy ending as well, even though for a while it looked quite, well, it can be a healthy relationship for what it was, but not last forever because they were at different stages of life.
You can tell that I hate a rom-com. No, I don't. But you can tell that I'm not a rom-com writer, yeah. Is it healthy? I don't know.
Yeah.
Brent's definitely, like, annoyingly well-adjusted.
Yeah.
But I don't know that they have a healthy relationship.
I suppose
I don't think it was unhealthy.
Yeah. It's not toxic in any way, which,
That's true.
You know, we would...
But, like, just because something isn't unhealthy doesn't mean it's
meant
healthy.
to be.
Like, it's somewhere in the, it's somewhere in the middle, I think.
Yeah. Like, they don't...
He serves some emotional support.
Yeah.
You know, he was a distraction to Dale.
It's probably unhealthy in the sense that Dale was very anxious about the whole thing and maybe wasn't fully being himself.
Like, maybe he wasn't in the right mindset for that relationship.
And Brent was... It's nice having a very well-adjusted character, you know, in a book where everyone is struggling with something that's happened to them.
But I do think that, going back to if their relationship is healthy or not, there's some fairly significant lack of communication.
That's true.
It seems like they kind of go backwards a little bit, which was also important to me to not have her be like, okay, well, now we're boyfriends and now we're, like, emotionally intimate in a way that is clearly discussed and now we're monogamous and we're not going to, you know, they just kind of don't talk about things. Anyway.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank you once again for coming on the show. We are at the end of our questions for today, but this has been such a wonderful discussion, and we love our author interviews, so it's always great to go in depth and to indulge our curious psychology minds about this stuff. So thank you so much, Robyn, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Awesome. Thank you.
And that wraps us up for today. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to check out our show notes on novelfeelings.com. We'll include links to the books that Robyn has recommended, as well as her website and social media. If you like us, please remember to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, those reviews really help other people find the show, so we really appreciate it. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, The Storygraph, and Goodreads via novel_feelings. And also check out Priscilla's Bookstagram over on @paved with books with an extra S. Thank you so much for listening. See you later.